Welcome everyone. Our second guest speaker this evening is Dr. Perry Mcintyre, based in Sydney, Australia. Her lecture tonight is Rippling Effects of the Great Irish Famine, Separated from Family by Crime and Transportation. Welcome, Perry. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And if you'd like to start when you're ready, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dolores, for inviting me. I'm not quite sure how you discovered me, but except that I've been trotting around Ireland for 30 years. So good to see you again too, Gerard. I've been telling people how a wonderful historian in Northern Ireland is going on holidays, and he was going to Kew for 4 days, and they all said, and what's your point? Of course, you go to an archive when you go on holidays. Where else would you go? I'm not sure what's going to happen next time I come to Ireland, because for my work on the Workhouse Orphan Girls for the last 10 years, I've been going to county libraries, and I've pretty much mined that. So you might have to give me some ideas what I'm going to do instead. Maybe go walk in the West with Mick Gibbons or something. I don't know. Anyway, we better get on with this. This talk for you this evening is going to be a bit all over the shop, in a sense that I'm going to talk a little bit about transportation, because other than a few people that I know online, and I see Kieran's not there yet if he's coming tonight, I don't know how much people know about transportation to Australia. So I'm going to do a little bit of a background, foreground, etc. So bear with me if I rabbit around. I'm focusing basically tonight on the immigration scheme for families of convicts that were sent to New South Wales, who are married, men mainly, who are married before they were transported. This scheme to reunite convict families seemed to me to be counterintuitive, given the aim of transportation was to banish criminals from the United Kingdom and Ireland. But in a twist of fate, the colonial authorities granted permission for a free passage for families of convict men who'd behaved since arrival. It will begin with an overview of the scheme to reunite families separated by crimes. And then I'll illustrate from documents found in Australia and Ireland, focusing on, as much as possible, or a few cases from Ulster. Having discovered this while I was doing professional genealogy back in the 80s, every time I went to an archive, I found an application by a convict man for his family. And I thought this was a bizarre thing. So that's what got me into it. And it ended up being my PhD. You're on the screen there. I don't know how to get rid of you all. Yes, I do. There we go. I was delighted to have it published by Irish Academic Press in 2011, and it's available around Ireland a bit. Because my examiners said it was too much to do with Ireland, and in fact only 60% of the people who applied were Irish, the rest being mainly English. So to get around that, my supervisor and supervisors in academia are very cute. We put Irish in it. So it became the reunion of Irish convicts and their families in Australia. When it was republished in Australia, I removed Ireland because it's more encompassing than just that. And it was republished here in 2018. And I have a few copies of that republishing in Dublin. If when I'm there in August, if anyone wants one, just yell. So the regulation for free passages of wives and families. Between 1788, when the first fleet arrived, until 1816, there were no official regulations. Families proceeded on an odd ad hoc basis, given permission by the governor, where employers would say, this is a good guy. If his wife and family are given a free passage, they can come and be employed with me, because he is also employed by me. In March 1817, it became official. There had to be means of proof that they could support their family before they were permitted to immigrate. In 1822, convicts had to still prove good good conduct and the ability to maintain their families. Regulations changed in February 1830, where they had to prove good conduct for at least half the period required for them to get a ticket of leave, which was a probational status. They were still convicts, but they were allowed to employ themselves out of the time when they were working for other people. So if you worked as a labourer from 9 to 5, in the evenings, if you were a shoemaker, you could make shoes. So that after 2 years for those with a 7-year sentence, after 3 years for those with a 14-year sentence, and after 4 years for those with a life sentence, those being the main sentences. There are occasional sentences to 10 years, but they're mainly in Tasmania. And a form was attached for the first time. In May 1833, the period was extended before they were allowed to apply. And in December 1842, the scheme terminated because transportation to New South Wales ceased in 1840, so that by December 1842, there were no convicts coming anymore, and these wives and families were actually put on female convict ships, which raises a whole nother issue, that there was obviously room on these female convict ships to put some more people. In 1847, it was revived, and the regulations included exiles, which I'll explain in a moment. In 1855, it was again modified, and by January 1852, remittance regulations were introduced, and again, I'll explain that. So the first notice was in the Sydney Gazette, which was the basically the Australian government-run precursor of newspapers. I typed that because it's virtually illegible, as you can see from the header. Microfilm's wonderful, but sometimes a bit tricky to read. Returns needed to be sent home of convicts who applied, and they had to prove that they were able to maintain their families. This is the form. An example here for a convict named John Hannabo. I wasn't able to get you one from Banbridge, I'm sorry, Dolores, without having to drive 70 kilometres to where the good government has decided to put our archives. Most archives around the place are a bit closer to town than that, except of course Kew, I suppose. So what you've got here is a form where the convict applies. It gives his name, the ship he comes on. So we've got John Hannabo here, who came on the Andromeda in 1830 with a 7-year sentence. This application is dated 1st of January 1833. And the 3 signatures at the bottom had to be 2 magistrates and the convict's employer. I don't know if can you see my cursor if I do that? No.
Yep.
Yeah. So
yep,
also here you've got the date that the employer John McDougall had signed that this guy John Hannabo had been working for him since January 1835. I think that says. The beauty for Ireland and for those of us in Australia is that the form also gives the details of the wife. So you can hear on the reverse of that page, reiterating that he's John Hannabo, that he comes on the Andromeda for a 7-year sentence. But his wife is Sarah Malley, or Malley, M-A-L-E-Y, and she's in Clashhaven in Clara in Kings County. Now, there was a huge problem I had with a descendant of these people who fought with me that these people were actually from Clare because they couldn't read Clara, but that's an issue we have. For local history, you've got the names of the 4 and ages of their 4 children, but you've also got on the bottom of this form people who could identify her back in Ireland. So there's the Reverend, and then a captain, and also another man, and their exact place. And I've discovered it frequently. The people who can certify this is the wife is actually the magistrate that convicted the husband to transportation. And then the bit that us historians get very excited about is there's also an annotation of pretty much everything that this guy did right through here on the back of the annotation, right to the bottom bit, which says nothing recorded. And in other words, he's permitted to have his wife and kids brought out. So he petitions for his 4 children in 1833. She does arrive on the female convict ship, the Roslyn Castle. You've lost my screen there. In 1836 with her 2 daughters. I also want to use a man called, that goes away, a man named John Whaley and his son, both of the same name, who were both transported on the Isabella in 1822. Their native place is simply Armagh, but they were tried in Carrickfergus in County Antrim. The father was aged 66, which again, we find bizarre. Why are they transporting a man aged 66? Because the theory being that they come here as workers and labourers. You wouldn't think they're going to get a lot of work out of a 66-year-old. I know we think 66 is not very old, but it certainly was in 1822. And their son, age 15, and his son, age 15, they committed this larceny together. So in 1826, April 1826, John Whaley Sr. applies from Sydney for a free passage for his wife and 7 children. In 1828, Sarah and 7 children arrive on the female convict ship Sir Joseph Banks, but not his eldest 2 sons. However, there was a son aged 4 months. Now, even if that son's 4 years, he's hardly likely to be the child of the transported husband. So there's some strange things going on here, and I'm not prepared to do the genealogy in Armagh to work that out because it's above and beyond us as historians. But this family knew how to work the system. The daughter, Ellen, who had come with her mother, was 18 when she arrived. She then married an ex-convict in the colony and applied for help for her convict husband, using all the available lures through the government applications. John Whaley Sr. also applied to have his eldest son, Daniel, assigned to him, following his transportation on the Captain Cook in 1831-32. And this is something to be aware of for those of you in Ireland. We tend to talk about the arrival date of a convict ship, where you, of course, refer to its departure date. So if there's a year difference, that's often the reason. The Captain Cook left at the end of 31 and arrived in Australia at the beginning of 1832. The son was tried in County Tyrone, but put down that he was a native of Down. So again, we've got confusion. Something that I want to bring to your attention, and Jared, I'm sure you're aware of this, given you have holidays in archives. The Chief Secretary's Office registered papers in Dublin are brilliant. And for my PhD, I spent years sitting there calling up boxes when you weren't allowed to, but I finally managed to get that permission to do so. And turning the pages, I mean, one piece of paper pulled out of an archive box is wonderful, but it's nothing like the context of the rest of the papers that are there. So I don't know if you're aware, I'm sure, Jared, you might be aware that Chief Secretary's Office registers papers are being digitised under a scheme where Francis Rowley did a bequest to catalogue the papers from 1818 when the surviving Chief Secretary's Office began to 1852. And they're now online up to 1833. They are transcribed, and sometimes you get the original documents. And I just wanted to let you know about that as well. There is one petition from Sarah Wiley, and this is what they've transcribed, not the original document. So she petitions in 1826, saying that she's from Belfast in the care of Hugh Woods at 61 Thomas Street, and she appeals to Richard Wellesley, the Lord Lieutenant, seeking permission for her family to join her husband and son, who were transported in 1822, noting that both men have been appointed to respectable positions. This document had nothing to do with wives and families of convict, but this petition I found in 1827, which was Dennis Ring, a vagrant ballad singer who was transported for mischievous and evil tendencies. Many of you will know Fintan Vallely, Ireland's famous flautist, who just happens to be the partner of Evelyn Conlon, the novelist in Dublin, who between them have become quite personal friends of mine. I thought Fenton was going to have an apoplexy when I found this, because he knew Ring's ballads. So this is how we work together across the world. There's also things like executions, and I was thinking particularly of the lecture last week by Karen Riley about evictions. These three men here are evicted, and there's a claim by three women who were witnesses in 1827. And I can't remember Kieran's talk now whether his evictions were that early or whether they were more, because we were talking about the famine in this lecture series, where they're more around the famine and post-famine. But just to make you aware, those who are not, of this sort of brilliant material. So back to the wives and families, there's a petition in CSORP from Joanna Sullivan, a wife of Patrick Sullivan, transported, who arrived in January 1821. Patrick petitioned for her from the colony and her daughter in 1822 and again in 1823. Correspondence found recently by a fellow historian in Australia, Damien Gleeson, who's done huge amounts of work on Reverend John Joseph Terry, who's the first official Catholic priest in the colony. His papers are in the Mitchell Library, and there are 65 boxes of them. Little scraps of paper where he's written marriages, baptisms, and never got around to putting them in the parish registers. It is a gold mine, and Damien's been working on that for some time and has just done a second, can you hear that, troops, a second PhD on this topic. One lifetime, not two. So Terry details those in Ireland who can identify her. In summary, the letter in Terry's paper says, "My beloved husband," and I'll read it in full because it really makes you aware of how transportation ripped families apart. "A few days ago, I received a letter from you dated nearly 2 years ago, and another one this day. I'm surprised that you would think anything would prevent me from going to you if I possibly could. It's untrue that I sold my houses, not the destitute poor, these convict families, or that I removed to South Main Street. I live with my mother still, and she is in great distress in consequence of one of her houses being untenanted this great while. As I've received no order to go to Australia, I'm afraid that all my exertions to get a free passage will be useless if I ever get one. You may rest assured that if I was certain of experiencing the greatest distress with you, it would rather be an incentive than otherwise to go to you. You seem to be unaware that it is absolutely necessary for persons in New South Wales to obtain an order from the governor for a passage for their families, and that the British government pays no attention to the kind of memorial you advised me to present to it. It gives me the greatest affliction when I see free women going to your colony so often through the interest of their husbands, most of whom have not half your influence. Since you left Ireland, I have secluded myself from all society, I've never spoken to Angleton, who was involved in having him transported, since I saw him in jail with you. Though apprised with poverty, I have too high a respect for my character to speak to such a person. I'm very sorry to inform you of the death of your poor niece, and she names her as Anne Sullivan, who died 4 months ago in consumption. Anne, who's their daughter, is grown a fine girl. She's constantly wishing to go to you. There are few girls her age better scholars, and we're talking here the early 1820s. I applied to William Fay for a loan of the postage for your letter, and he refused me. My mother sends her love to you, and she talks about other former acquaintances. Your mother's in good health when I last heard from her. I remain yours. Joanna and her daughter Anne do get a free passage on the female convict ship, the Neva. Now, some of you may have heard of the Neva. The Neva sailed in 1835, and the captain, by the time they got to southern Australia, he decided rather than go around the bottom of Tasmania, he ducked through the passage, and the Neva hit a reef and sank. Everybody on board, all of the convict wives and families of children, and this ship had quite a number on it, drowned, and only a few female convicts and a few crew survived. So they got that close. As a very Protestant friend of mine in Australia says, the Irish do disaster well. I also want to point out to you, if you want a quick hit on Irish convicts to New South Wales, a friend of mine in Canberra did this index some years ago, an index to convicts to New South Wales from the original documents. I can never remember its URL, and I don't know about the rest of you. Dr. Google is a wonderful thing. I simply Google Irish convicts. Peter Maybury is the man's name. You can see it on the top there, Mayberry. And this is an interactive index. It doesn't have absolutely everything, but it is a good hit for trying to find convicts. And I just looked here, searched for marriage. There were 4,761 hits out of the 30,000 that Peter's got indexed here. And I want to talk to you very briefly about those three that I've got an asterisk on there. George Assison on the Waterloo in 1831 was tried in Enniskillen in County Fermanagh. He was 40. He could read and write. He was a Protestant. He stole a heifer. The indent shows that he had a wife and 2 children. I assume all of you are rural enough to know what a heifer is. A young female cow. He gives references. Reverend John Richardson in Fermanagh, Captain Gabbett in Enniskillen, and Captain James Coff, who could identify his wife. When he applied for his wife, he was in the service of Rupert Kirk since May 1831. His wife's name, her maiden name is Matilda Hampton, living in Derry Vallon, as written. I'm sure it's not quite that, but VULLEN, it'll probably something else. And he names 2 children, Margaret aged 7 and Alexander aged 5. The police office in Sydney reported in May 1835 that it did not appear that George Assison per Waterloo had been charged with any offence in Australia, and his petition was approved and forwarded home. Response from Dublin Castle in August 1836 was that Matilda and her 2 children could not be found. Documents in the Colonial Secretary's papers in New South Wales show her and her children in a list of 82 names that are given permission, but they could not find her. There's no obvious sign that she or her daughters ever arrived, unless the daughters came later as married women, and that's quite possible. The two Agnews there, Henry and James, you'll see that they come on the same ship, the St. Vincent's, that their trial place is Derry, and they are given life sentences. This is a father and son crime. But in the marital status column, you'll notice that the father is married with 2 male and 1 female children, and he has a brother, Henry, who is already on the same ship. Sorry, it's not father and son, it's the brothers. They were transported for life for being accessory to murder. James applies for his wife and 3 children, and they do eventually come. Despite the crime, it does not seem to matter whether they were petty larceny or whether, in this case, accessory to murder. If in the colony they were considered to be, reasonably well behaved, then their families were given a free passage. That's the blank form of Peter Maybury's quick find tool for Irish convicts to Australia. But look, always look at the originals. Peter's is a good quick hit, but it's nothing like looking at the original documents. I don't know how many of you use Ancestry. I don't use it necessarily to look at family trees, but they have got huge amounts of original documents up there, including the New South Wales Convict Indents, which is the name for the passenger list of the convict ships from 1788 to 1842. So do use that, please. I vaguely mentioned at the beginning remittance regulation. After transportation ceased and this scheme ceased, from 1853, anybody could put down a certain sum of money to have families and friends or members of a parish brought to Australia. This is 1855, where Thomas Brennan puts down £27, 10 shillings to have the Coghlan family, husband and wife, James and Anne, and their children brought out to Australia. This went on roughly until 1900. The original documents in the archives do not seem to survive the actual applications, but this register, which you've got a page in front of you, does survive. We'll just stay on remittance regulations for a second. Some of you will be asking whether women could apply for their families. I had 65 examples out of my 2,500 formal applications that I discovered in the archives. There were 65 applications from women. One case of Anne Byrne, transported from Dublin in 1815, applied for her son, who had been sent to the Foundling Hospital. He did actually come free on a mail transport in 1823. Boys over the age of 12 were not able to come on female convict ships. Goodness knows what they thought a 12-year-old boy was going to do to the women on the female convict ship, but they were not allowed to come on female convict ships, but they were permitted to come on male convict ships, and Anne Byrne's son did arrive. Another, Mary Rahill, R-A-H-I-L-L, Rahil, various spellings, of course, of her name, was transported in 1830, and she applied for her son, who was in the care of the jailer in Cavan. Obviously, she had gone to jail with her son, and he was left behind when she was transported. But correspondence show that he actually died. Exiles after transportation to New South Wales ceased in 1840. There was huge push to restart transportation because they needed male convict workers. There was a group of convicts that came in the 1840s, 1845 basically to 49, to Sydney, to Port Phillip, which became Melbourne in 1851 when Victoria became a separate colony, Before then, it was still run by New South Wales and called Port Phillip. After then, it became Melbourne. Melbourne became the capital and it became a separate colony. Victorians are very thing about they didn't ever have convicts transported to their colony. However, these families, these convicts left Ireland under transportation, but the minute they put their foot on the soil here, they were given a ticket of leave and allowed to work. So by 1847, they had a new set of regulations where exiles could apply for their families. And this, of course, is the height of the famine, Black 47 indeed. Just a quick overview of the Australian penal settlements. Botany Bay or Sydney had transportation, as I've just said, 1788 to 1840, and then a revival for the exiles in 4950. Hobart or Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, had transportation to 1853. And this is something to keep in mind for Irish transportation. When convict transportation stopped in New South Wales in 1840, and they had very few Irish transported to Hobart before then, all of the Irish then went to Tasmania between 1840 and 53. There were a couple of ships that went directly to Norfolk Island at the end of transportation in 50s. And of course, the Swan River settlement in Western Australia started transportation in 1850 and it went to 1868. It's remarkable to think that it went 1868 is merely 100 years before the year I finished school in 1968. World conflates, does it not? And the amount of convicts transported to all of these colonies, including Western Australia, was only 161,000. I say only because it is merely a handful of the number of immigrants, either coerced or not, a term Deborah Oxley used for convict transportation, compared to the number of assisted immigrants and free immigrants that came later. Tasmania had quite a different system. If you're looking for a convict in New South Wales, you have to look for every step of their steps to freedom, from their arrival to their ticket of leave, to their conditional pardon, to their application for their family. Every single document is a separate entity. In Tasmania, they had this wonderful register called a black book, where everything to do with the life of a convict was recorded. On screen is the colonial file for Fardie McGrory, transported on the British Sovereign on St. Patrick's Day, arriving on St. Patrick's Day, 1841. He's from Tyrone, again for stealing heifers, lots of agrarian rural crime going on at this stage. He's Catholic, he's 30 and single. He was once drunk in the colony. 10 years after his transportation, he went across from Tasmania to Melbourne, where he married a Limerick workhouse orphan girl, and they had 8 children, and he died in 1870. His wife, Mary Crichton, lived on until 1914. She's just one famine immigration story and linked through workhouse and transportation. So we're touching on the famine, but starting with convict transportation. Caroline Chisholm's involvement in the Wives and Families of Convicts scheme, that's a portrait of her on the left-hand side in the State Library of New South Wales. Many of you will know of Caroline Chisholm. She's an English-born convert to Catholicism who pioneered and standardised much of the handling of the newly arrived immigrants in Australia between 1838 and 1845. She advocated for immigrant welfare, established depots in the country where immigrants could be housed before they were hired out. and depots such as that at Hyde Park Barracks in Sydney, which was opened for the first time as an immigrant barracks in 1819 and closed virtually at the end of transportation in 1840, but opened again with the advocation of Caroline Chisholm when the first female orphan girls arrived in 1848, and they were housed there. For the Wives and Families of Convicts scheme, she went back to England to have a serious discussion with her mate, Earl Grey, Secretary for State of the colony, who ran all immigration to New South Wales. After this free immigration scheme for the wives and families of convicts stopped in 1840, there were still men in the system who had been given permission, but their applications had sort of fallen off the twig, if you like, because there was no convict ships for female convict ships for these women to come on. So Caroline, I have a vision of her in front of Earl Grey, the Secretary of State, jumping up and down and saying, "Come on, this is unfair." And so with her advocacy, the system started again, and convict wives and families were brought to Australia on ordinary immigrant ships. And she hired a ship called the Waverley. And we used to have a $5 note in Australia with her face on it and an image of the Waverley. The arrow points to the little flag right on the top of the ship that, if you got the magnifying glass out on the old $5 note, actually said Waverley. To my mind, unfortunately, this image has now disappeared and been replaced by the ex-Queen, Betty Windsor. She's still there. I don't know whether we're going to get Charles or not, but we'll see. We can discuss republicanism in Australia later, should you like. Whoops. For Dolores, I looked for a Banbridge man and found Stephen Doyle, transported on the Lady Macnaghten in 1835 for false pretences. He was a groom and policeman, aged 35, could read and write, was born in Banbridge. On the indent, despite having been indicated on the indent that he was single, in September 1839, he applied for a wife, Jane McCrone, living in Newry Street, Banbridge. His application was refused, not because he seemed to have lied about being single, but because of punishments in the colony. He'd received 50 lashes for losing sheep in January 1836, and another 50 lashes for again losing sheep in January 1837, and again in April 1837 for refusing to take charge of sheep. I think, despite the fact he might have been a groom and a policeman, a good shepherd he was not. By 1841, he had his ticket of leave, but in January 1842, it was again cancelled for extorting money. Nevertheless, he obtained his certificate of freedom in December 1842. And I'm sorry, he then disappeared from the records. I've no idea what happened to him or whether his supposed wife ever got a free passage. And I'm just going to speak a couple of overviews here. I've no idea what time it is, but I should stop soon. A few overviews of convicts from County Down. David Gordon was transported on the Earl St Vincent in 1837 and applied for his wife and 6 children who did arrive on the Sir Joseph Banks. Hugh O'Hare, tried in Downpatrick, had a wife arrive on the Surrey in 1836 with 2 sons, and I'm fairly sure that their 3 daughters also came. Peter Sloane, per regalia from Carrickfergus, his wife wrote to the Chief Secretary's office in Dublin, wanting to partake of her husband's calamity. And there are lots of connections here. I mean, whether that language is designed to get them free passages or not. I mean, I suppose it is. They're playing the game as hard as they can. But as the previous letter from Joanna Sullivan said, unless the husband applied here, their chances were nil. There's a few from Newton Ards. For example, John MacDonald came on the James Patterson in 1830. It looks like she had a child after he left, but this child was allowed to immigrate. It's an interesting case because it raises issues of how officials dealt with the supposed strict regulations relating to transportation and immigration, both here in Australia and in the UK and Ireland. Some seemed very strict, while other people were not so strict and let people get away with all sorts of variations on the strict regulations. John Kirk applied in April 1826 for a wife and 2 children, but he remarried in the colony in 1833, stating himself as single. His petition was accepted, and in Ireland, in the National Archives, in Chief Secretary's office papers, his wife, Isabella Kirk, received an order to go in 1826. It reads, "Honourable Sir, it appears that an order has been sent from the Governor of New South Wales to His Excellency the Lord Lieutenant to send out Isabella Kirk and her family, who he is a convict here. She is shortly expected, and it's signed by her as Isabella Kirk of Cooma in County Down in 1826. The clerical annotation says, "Is this so?" I also looked at Mark Anstey on the Dunvegan Castle in 1832, who was transported for manslaughter. His wife and 4 children arrived in the colony in February 1833, but her husband died in March 1836 in the Liverpool hospital, and then she had huge trouble supporting herself. The Attorney General, John Costello, felt sorry for her and allowed 2 of her 4 children to go to the orphan school, making the comment that they were Protestants, as was he. One child, John, admitted in June 1833, died in November of whooping cough, and his sister was discharged in March 1836. I've not followed them further, as in my PhD I was merely interested in the convict applications and what happened back in Ireland and whether they were, Ireland and England of course, whether they were then permitted to continue. Overall in this scheme I found 2,034 formal applications between 1817 and 1842, resulting in the immigration of almost 5,000 women and children who came entirely free to the colony of New South Wales. And of course, the same scheme applied in Tasmania, where the records unfortunately are not as good, so I haven't looked at those in as greater detail. These wives and families of convicts and the 4,114 workhouse young orphan girls who left during the famine years of 1848 to 50, plus about 800 children who were left behind when their parents immigrated in the 1840s, because they were not allowed to come with too many young children on immigrant ships, because the authorities were acutely aware of the transmission of diseases among young children. These 3 groups are the only people other than the convicts who ever came to Australia totally free. Immigration here is quite a different story from that to America. Because of the long distance, it was very regulated. People were fed on board ship. They were given, the famine orphan girls were given a passage from the workhouse to Dublin and occasionally on a ship to Plymouth. And then the long voyage from Plymouth to Australia was paid for by the Colonial Land and Immigration Commissioners. So I'm sorry this has been a little bit, I'll stop here, a little bit ratty this evening for you, but I needed to do some background of convict transportation, even though it's not necessarily relating to the famine. And then, of course, during the famine years, these women are often in jails, not necessarily because they committed a crime, but it was one of the few places, the few institutions where they found refuge during the famine. And I could talk of that forevermore. And I just need to tell you the last slide, which is never give up and look everywhere. Okay, that's it from me tonight, but I'm open for questions.
Thank you very much, Perry. I find it amazing that people managed to keep in contact. People who had been sent to Australia, to the colonies, managed to keep in contact, communication with family members back home.
Many of them couldn't read and write, and it was while I was doing this, a woman in Newcastle upon Tyne was doing her PhD there, using virtually the same documents I used in the archives here, but she was looking at the social aspects, exactly that, of the, and unfortunately she died a few years ago without publishing that. You might be able to get her PhD up. Tina Picton Phillips was her name, Picton Phillips with 2 L. I think it's online through Edinburgh Uni. She did it. But I learned a word during that period from her. An amiensis is someone who writes a letter for somebody else.
Okay.
I don't even know if that's how you say it. Jared, you might have a better pronunciation. I'm asking a man from Northern Ireland from an Australian how you pronounce a word, but you know, we're all mad here. Yeah.
Jared, sorry, I'm just getting my thoughts together. Have you anything to comment on?
Well, first of all, thanks a million, Perry. Very, very interesting. It's amazing the wealth of material that's obviously in Australia. Obviously, it varies from place to place, but I just find fascinating the petitions. I mean, yes, you mentioned the CSORP, 1852. They have been indexed until 1833. I wouldn't be holding my breath to get the 1852.
No, it's been stalled at, I thought it was stalled at 32 till I went online yesterday and discovered they'd gone up to 33. So maybe it's progressing, but I don't know anyone in archives anymore. I mean, 18 Island was my great go-to, and that during my presentation, you'll notice there's a huge poster of the Ardagh chalice on my wall, which I admired in her office one day, and she came out with it rolled up and said, "Here, I'm retiring soon, take it home."
Well, I just find the petitions, I mean, because you come across so many types of petitions, and even there's lots of petitions from widows who are absolutely living in penury. You got petitions from, and this is for a general audience, but petitions from men who have fought in the British Army. You'll find petitions from men who say, I fought in Napoleonic Wars, I was blinded, I was disabled, and they're looking for, they've got no means of an income. And the CSORP, it's a word search. So it can be a name, it can be a subject like famine or potatoes or shortage or anything at all. It can be area, of course. There's so much there. You mentioned the ballad singer, which I found very interesting. I've come across that. I mean, ballad singers were seen as seditious, and especially in 1847-48, the time of the 1848 Rising. I came across a ballad singer who had moved from in around the Fermanagh, Donegal area. He was eventually arrested, and he was singing songs in favour of repeal and what were regarded as anti-British songs at the time. But it's the documents now. Okay, quite literally a drop in the ocean, but the documents you mentioned there in terms of names, they do provide some sense of a census substitute, given that we have nothing from 1821 until 1901, you know. So, I mean, to come across where you've got lists of family names and relatives and that is fascinating to think that they're in Australia. I don't think that too many people, maybe I'm speaking out of ignorance, are aware of that. In relation to, I mean, it's...
I just interrupt you there Ireland's not the only place that destroys its censuses. We don't make ours public for privacy reasons. Can you believe? So we can't use them. For the only one from the 19th century is the 1828.
Right, right. Well, and in terms of, I mean, I have seen in workhouse minutes where women are asking to follow their convict husband to Australia.
Yep.
Now,
Yep.
it's not by no means common, but it does happen. Of course, they're only too happy to send them eventually because it's another person or persons less in the workhouse and less rates to be paid. And it's I'm sure obviously you know about the Carrick-Macross where they've basically reinstituted you were saying about how, which is fascinating, the difference between the regulation going to Australia and going to America. And the girls who were sent out in 1848, 49, they were given clothes, they were given a suitcase as such, they were given, and it's outlined in great detail in the Board of Guardians minutes. Carrick-Macross has a great example of that. And in Carrick and Shannon in May, in a couple of months, they're actually unveiling 2 statues representing the girls who left the Carrick and Shannon workhouse in 1849. And there's going to be some sort of a ceremony there in May this year, which I'm supposed to be at, unless Armagh is playing in the championship, of course, in which case I won't be at it.
Well, if you hear any of those, I have booked a flight on the 6th of April. I'll be over, not April, August. I'll be over August, September, but only for about 3 weeks. So.
Well, they'll be unveiled by then, but they're making an effort to acknowledge that girls actually left. And, Trevor McCaffrey's book, Barefoot and Pregnant.
McLaughlin.
Sorry, Bernard McLaughlin. Sorry, but his book where he outlined the Trevor McLaughlin. That was the Trevor McLaughlin's book. The names and the townlands. So the townlands are a bit dodgy in it, but fascinating. Really, really groundbreaking material there. But they're in Carrick. They're actually acknowledging it, and it's one of the things. I suppose one of the things that kills you as a researcher, and Dolores alluded to it there, was you get one letter, but you don't get the reply. So whether it be to America or to Australia, and you'll see letters where the family be saying, we haven't heard from you in 6 months, we haven't heard from you in a year, and that's it. You don't get the reply then, and you'd love to get that catalogue of material, that huge amount of material to be there.
Can I interrupt again here?
Absolutely.
At the moment, I'm trying to write the overview history of the workhouse orphan girls, having been to every county archive around Ireland and trolled those minutes. So I know precisely what you're saying about that. Unfortunately, not a lot of indoor registers survive for the Republic, but PRONI, you all know what PRONI is, Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, have got a wonderful collection for the 6 counties.
Indoor registers, there's 12.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of indoor registers that survive,
but
it's the minutes, as you say, it's the minutes that give the minutiae of getting organized, supplying clothes, which was necessary under the regulations from the Colonial Land and Immigration Commissions. They had to have an outfit of clothes for the voyage. So these girls who had, never put a shoe on their foot in their lives suddenly got 2 pairs of shoes, 5 gowns, however much. Unbelievable stuff. And as you say, some of the wives and families of convicts were given refuge in the workhouse, and then allowed to go. I mean, it's just, we all need to work together a lot more, I think.
Just going back to the families, when family members would have travelled, families were reunified. I'm sure there wasn't a case of domestic bliss in many instances too, when they've been separated for so long.
Can you imagine your husband's transported? I'm now talking to the girls in this. Your husband's transported. And in the case of John Tye from Heapstown, County Sligo, where there is a letter that survives back from the priest, when the colonial secretary writes to them, the priest replies and says, your wife can't go at the moment, she's in the fever. She does eventually come. She goes with her brother to America and then pays her own passage from America to Sydney 25 years after he is transported. You wouldn't even know what he looked like, would you?
No.
And her children, who were 5 and 7, are now grown married women, and they go back with her too. I just find it, the hackles rise on my back when I talk about it. I find it
hard to get the head round it, actually.
And that's a case we know of. I mean, there's hundreds we don't know about.
And I'm
Yeah.
sure there's instances where families did travel or wives did travel and
Well, if they got
I'm
a bit
sh-
of money and they
they
could pay
got,
their own passage,
yeah.
they're the ones we
And may
lose.
also have regretted it too, because that's it. Suddenly again, meeting this total stranger because you've been separated for so long.
But for me, sitting in Australia, what our work here can do is, for Ireland, these people are gone forever, forgotten, disappeared, if you like. We found them, and so they can be kind of reunited to their townland, right to the spot from where they came, because they do mention their townlands. I mean, my knowledge of townlands is probably better than some Irish people. I'm just, my pronunciation is up the creek. Depending, I can say Guido and Clochaneely quite well though, because of another project that I've worked on. It depends. I don't know. I'm prattling because I just get so excited by it. Sorry, it's like going to an archive, Jared.
And great and interesting too, the fact that some children travelled who clearly were not the biological children of the
Yeah,
individual.
and the authorities are kind of turning a blind eye to that,
Yeah.
obviously. And yet there's other cases where no, that woman's been cohabitating with someone else. We're not going to let her go. Just depends on the man who reads your piece of paper, doesn't it? But still, okay. I always say, for the wives and for the Irish immigrant women, always, particularly the workhouse orphan girls who come here as adolescents, in theory they're 13 to 19. I've looked at all 4,114. There's one who's 28 who seems to slip in somehow, but the rest of them, if they're 20, they're getting too old. And they marry 2 or 3 years after they arrive. So they're barely touching 21. And they marry men who are 30, 35, 45. I think love's got nothing to do with it, really. It's a stable life, a home.
Oh, completely. It's simply
You know,
it's
Virginia Woolf's Room with a View sort of stuff,
well, I think, listen, I think we'll finish up for this evening. But Perry, again, thank you so much. I know we're going to have another, maybe one or hopefully one or two series of lectures over the next 12 months or so, and I'd hopefully be able to invite you back again to talk. That would be great if that's okay.
Yeah.
I think
Kieran wasn't on, but I'll email him a question. When I was doing a famine thing the other day, I had Bridget O'Donnell, and her children, that image that's in the Illustrated London News in 1849, which no one ever reads the text of. And she's evicted. Whether that was a large scale eviction in that area or not, maybe Kieran's looked at that. I don't know.
yeah, usually he's on, but he hasn't been on tonight.
No, he hasn't been on. I'll email him. I do have his email.
Yeah. Would it be possible to invite you back to talk about some of the actual individual girls and their lives, maybe in the next series? I think that'd be really. I think it's so people are so. I think for most of us, it's so interesting to get that human story and of the
because
individual. And
they're sent out of the workhouse aged 15, 16, and they're gone to you.
yeah. It's a narrative of that period that most people aren't aware of happened.
Here's a woman in Western Australia. Hello, Laura. That's another thing. While she's on, I'll say the Workhouse Orphan Scheme, strictly Earl Grey's, ran 1848 to 1850, basically to New South Wales, to Port Phillip, and to Adelaide. But there were immigrants and single girls that came out of the workhouses later, and there's a whole group that went from the workhouse is gone. She might have to type it in there for me. To Western Australia in 1853, Mount Belleau workhouse in 1853, and yeah, a whole big group of them went, and I'd love to look at that, but I'm trying to, Jared, you'll understand this, focus on one thing so I get it done.
Absolutely.
I mean, I'll be dead in my grave with 80 projects out there on the finger if I don't do some.
Yep.
No, Harry,
getting any younger. Fortunately, I'm still okay, but yeah.
Yeah, no, it takes a lot of work, a lot of
So
effort, a
yeah,
lot of time,
um,
big commitment. So that's us, Jared.
Right, good stuff.
Perry, thank you so much. Thanks again for so much
Thanks,
for
Perry.
joining us. I'll definitely be in touch. I really would appreciate you
Yeah.
coming back for the next series to talk maybe in depth about a few of the girls you've researched. That'd be so interesting.
Yeah.
Are you going to go back now for a wee bit of a little bit of a catch up and some sleep?
No, it's half past 8. There's a pool up the road. I might go for a swim.
Okay.
Well, you've got to get out of your,
We do the
unfortunately, you have
same.
to get out of your chair occasionally, or you can't walk when you do.
Perry, thank you very much. Everyone else who has stayed with us for this time of night, thank you everyone for staying with us too. I know that certainly everybody's really enjoyed your presentation tonight. And sure, Jared, I'll see you next week too.
Good stuff, Dolores. See you then.
Perry,
Good
take
luck.
care.
See you, Perry.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Good night, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Yes.